Hey, solopreneurs, Gabe here. Today we have Kevin Gainey, the beingness coach, on the podcast. He's a high performance coach and he's got some fantastic information to share with you regarding effectiveness versus execution. And he's got an amazing life changing story that I think you're going to love hearing. So give it a listen. Kevin, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Gabe. It's an honor to be here, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, what the listeners don't know is I've been trying to get you on the podcast for a few months now. We met earlier in the spring, and sure enough, Memorial Day weekend comes along, and you have a major health emergency that you were just explaining to me. And if you don't mind, I'd love to start there because it has some tremendous lessons for solopreneurs. So, Kevin, what happened?
Well, you have those days where you're planning for something. You're going to have a long weekend, Memorial Day. We're going to have a big cookout and everything. I woke up around 5 a.m. on the Saturday before Memorial Day, let the dog out, let the dog back in. And when I closed the door, I felt something funny in my chest. So it was kind of a weird feeling. And usually I just don't pay those things any attention. I just go back to bed, sleep it off, and get up and go about my day. But this time, I'm glad I listened to my intuition. Had my girlfriend take me to the ER, and come to find out, probably about 13 hours later, I went into surgery. I ended up having a dissected aorta, ascending aorta, so on the front side of your chest, which is basically an aortic aneurysm. And so I was slowly bleeding out, and I don't remember anything after about 6 a.m. From what I'm told, I actually checked myself into the hospital, and they did all kinds of scans. They thought it was a pulmonary embolism or a heart attack, or all these different things. But it's a very rare condition. As I look back on it now, I had to go into, I had to have emergency open heart surgery, and as I look back on it now, uh, it it's changed a lot in my life. But just going through that, I've got some fun stories that my family and I go through now because you don't expect those things. But we also had some crazy things happen because of that. But it really gives you a new perspective on life.
Yeah, I bet it does. Basically, you were within maybe hours of bleeding out and not being left on this earth.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked to the doctor. That like it was 6 days later, really, before I came to and came out of everything in the ICU. So they had to kind of keep me intubated and everything. But the doctor said, they went in, they had to ask people, hey, this is what we're going to do. If we don't do it now, he's going to bleed out. We've got the doctors coming in. I am very fortunate and I'm sure if there's anybody on the medical community in your listener pool that will understand this, and I don't mean any disrespect, but sometimes when you go to an ER or you go to a doctor on a holiday weekend, you kind of get people with lower seniority sometimes in the hospital or like urgent care, just because the people who have done more, they've earned their seniority, they're at the beach with their family. We lucked out. We had a really good cardiothoracic surgeon, came in, took care of everything, got me fixed up. And yeah, it was probably 5 to 6 days later before I was really conscious and really, I knew something wasn't right. And I had no idea what had happened. And so that's when my family started telling me everything that transpired over those 5 or 6 days. And then I was in the hospital for another 6 days, just recovering and resting. So, but the the interesting conversation I had in the hospital was when I was going from ICU to a step down room, and one of the nurses in there, the doctor had already told me how close it was, but this nurse put it in very simple terms. She said, "You're lucky to be here. We see a lot of things on the cardiothoracic ICU, but you're extremely lucky to be here. And this was something that was completely random. This wasn't based on lifestyle decisions. There was no heart disease. There was no clogged arteries or genetics or anything like that. They said that this is just a random fluke. And I was like, great, maybe I should go buy a lottery ticket. Maybe that'll, if my cards are coming up like this. But she told me, she said, you're here for a reason. Don't waste it. And, and I was paying attention to her and I was listening, and my kids were in the room at the time, and, they hear it and they're like, oh yeah, dad's still here kind of thing. But it was in that moment that, I'm pretty intentional based on the work that I do, but it was in that moment that I started really questioning it. It was the first lucid moment I kind of had in the hospital for, why am I here? What am I doing? How can I be even more intentional with what I want to do? Because you get a second chance like that, you don't want to take it for granted, and you don't want to squander that opportunity. And so having that nurse be able to just point blank cut right to the issue and tell me, hey, this is what you got to look out for, um, and find that reason and run with it.
So what what were your thoughts after that? I mean, yes, don't squander this, but then did you start going, all right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I've got this second chance at life. I'm going to go do X or do Y. I mean, what were the things going through your mind or the actions you took once you were able to?
Um, I just realized there was one thing, and we were talking earlier, I didn't share with you, but I think it adds to it a little bit more. Is while I was in surgery, my family and my kids and friends, they were in the waiting room. They kind of had special permission to be there with COVID practices and everything. Nobody else was in the hospital because it was Memorial Day weekend. And they actually had an active shooter uh, in the emergency room. And so they closed down, went over the intercom, said, hey, we got an active shooter situation. Run, hide, and fight. And my family is just sitting in the waiting room, and they're like, what the hell do we do? And so finally they run, they barricade themselves in a restroom, and they were in there for like 45 minutes. And finally they came out, and somebody had tried to get into the restroom with them, but they had the door barricaded, and we think it was another person. It wasn't a shooter, it was another person just trying to get safely in there, but it really scared my family too. So we had this whole emotional conversation about, when you ask what the first thing I did was, after they told me that, my first thing was to just hug them all really tight and kiss them, because you don't you don't you don't realize how you think you're going through your own stuff, and at the same time other people are going through the same different things, but they're kind of learning the same lesson. So here my family is, I'm in emergency surgery, and they're you know barricaded in a restroom trying to, not sure what's going on. And fortunately at the hospital nobody was hurt. They were able to safely handle the situation with the active shooter, but it put a lot of fear in my kids, fear for themselves, fear for what was going on with me. And so I've been able to have deeper conversations. That's the very first thing that, I started doing. And shortly after I got out of the hospital, actually the day after I came home, my mom went to the hospital and was diagnosed with when she went to the ER, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, had surgery 2 weeks later. She's still in the hospital at this point. And it's just all these constant reminders that don't squander the opportunity and don't squander the life that you have. And are you being intentional? And how much more intentional can you be? So some of the first things I did, other than loving on my family and, you know, updating my will and my power of attorney and all those other things that are good to do, was I looked at all the commitments I have in my life, and I thought, okay, is this something that is worth my time? And not in a cocky way, like, oh, that's not worth my time, but in a, is this what I want to invest my time in and my resources and my energy and my talents? And there are some things that I had kind of been letting them wither on the vine, but I decided to intentionally say, hey, you know what? I'm going to meet this commitment and then I'm going to move on. And, it's always been amicable with the people that I've worked with in those situations. They completely understand. But being able to do that gives you a little bit more of a sense of freedom. And then looking at my business, as a solopreneur, I am the business at this point. I have systems in place. But if I stop coaching, if I stop creating content, there's only so far it's going to go without me. And because I'm not to that point where I've built up this big team and somebody can come in and take over for me. But I started looking at all those things and those systems and trying to figure out, okay, how can I optimize these? They're working, they're effective, they're getting the results I want. But how can I get better results with maybe less time? And so, the doctors told me when I got home, take 6 to 8 weeks and don't do anything. And that was, at first, that was easy because I was so exhausted. But then it became a mental battle and you're fighting in your own mind for, you want to do something, but your body's not listening. Your body's not cooperating. It needs rest. And so during that time, that's when I would just kind of sit and think about, who can I reach? Who can I share my story with? Who can I help? And who's going through similar crap that, they don't know what their next steps are and they need some guidance or they need some assistance in figuring that out. And those are the people that I really want to help, especially as far as business owners go and managing a business as a solopreneur, taking care of your health and being very intentional about every step of it and every facet of your business.
So you had that piece of, okay, I'm gonna make some changes and I'm gonna move forward in a very intentional way. And that was actually what we talked about months ago, of having you talk about, I believe it was effectiveness versus execution, which then centers around intentionality, correct?
It does, yes. It's let's think about it this way. Let's say that you set a goal to write a book. The end result is you've got a book that you send off to the public. You've got a completed manuscript that you send off. But you don't think of yourself as a writer. So you need to become the type of person who is a writer. And there's really one thing a writer does to be a writer, and that is to sit down and write. And so some people will sit down on Monday and write 3,000 words. Tuesday and Wednesday, they go golfing. Thursday, they write 1,500 words. Friday, maybe another 1,500. So they got their 5,000 words for the week. That may have been their goal, but odds are it would have been a lot less stressful if they had sit down every day and wrote 1,000 words and then continued to do that every day, 5 days a week. If you just want to sit down and crank out 1,000 words, and the more effectively you can do that, that is your execution. Are you doing the things you say you're going to do? Now, because that comes down to who you are as a writer. A writer is not somebody who periodically throws out 2,000 or 3,000 words and then comes back a month later and writes another chapter and spends 18 hours a day doing that. The ones who are consistent, the ones who get the work done and put their art out there into the world, they write consistently, and it's in smaller chunks. Now, sure, there are times they've got to get a manuscript completed by a certain date, but being able to do something consistently, that defines who you are and who you're becoming. And that will get you further in life than the random moonshots of writing 5,000 words or 10,000, or trying, some people try to sit down and think they can crank out a whole book in one sitting. And I'm sure somebody's done that before, but that's the hard way to do it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when you said the book piece. I set out to write a book, and I ended up authoring a book, and then hired a company to interview me and do the writing, a professional writer. I'm actually going to have him on the podcast and interview him, which I think is going to be fantastic to have someone who interviewed me for 6 months share the insights and the things that came from interviewing me and then writing in my voice.
Right.
And my book mentor told me when I was interviewing them and I was going through the sample writings that my writer came up with for me, and he's like, make sure it sounds like you, but better. And this guy just hit it right on. Um, but the interesting thing is I was reminded of when I decided I was going to do it. I sat down and I basically took 15 minutes every single day for 5 days a week for a few months to do the outline of the book. It's like, all right, I'm going to take 15 minutes. I set my timer. I went through and did it. And the inspiration for that came from reading the book, The Slight Edge.
Yep.
The book, The Slight Edge, it's actually right here behind me by Jeff Olson. And that was the whole thing of just consistently going through it. And that's very interesting that you point that out and even use the book analogy, which is, yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I find out a lot of the people that I work with, that's a big goal that a lot of people have. Like that might be, for some of them, they might just call it a dream. Maybe they haven't set it as a goal, but when they start working on it, they're like, oh, I'd like to be an author. I'd like to be a published author. Another example is, of course, it's better to set aside, let's say $100 a month in your investments or your savings than it is, just to do that consistently month after month after month after month. That's going to get you further in life than only putting, half of your annual bonus in if you get one. And so it's the same kind of thing. And so you can be effective in life, but your odds, if you execute consistently, your odds of being effective are just multiplied, infinitely, because you've become the type of person that makes that happen. And so, if you have a goal of, let's say, I want to, we'll go back to the book example. If you want to write a book and you say, I'm going to write 1,000 words a day, and you do that 4 days a week, you're executing at 80%. Now, executing that 80%, people always like to use baseball as the example that, anything over batting 300 will get you into the Hall of Fame. I'm like, if you're batting 80% of the time, then your odds of success dramatically increase. And so, but there are also things you have to consider. Well, what are the tactics that you're executing on? Because maybe you're executing the wrong tactics and then you're no longer effective. Or there are some people, we set goals that we know we can meet, and so we're effective, but we're not having to execute. We're not really having to do anything, so we're not growing as a person. So when I contrast effectiveness and execution, you want both of those to work together. And the number one thing I see is when I'm coaching people is if they're not reaching their goals, if they're not being effective, they want to change the goal or they want to change the tactic or the strategy that they're doing. They don't want to execute more or execute more consistently. They think it is the tactic or the plan that is not working. Oh, I want to, I've got a sales script. I need to call 20 people a day to close these, offers. Well, they're not getting their sales targets, but they're only calling 5 people a day. And instead of calling 20 a day consistently, they'll say, well, I need a new sales script. Well, you don't really know because you didn't use the existing sales script with a large enough sample. And so we want to change, and it's natural. We want to change. We like to plan, especially for higher level thinkers and managers. It's like, okay, we need a different plan. It's not, we need to implement and execute more consistently. So when we can focus on that and we see people that are executing at 80% and they're still not setting their goals, that's when I'm like, hey, I think now you've proven that you need a different strategy and you need something more effective. So.
Very interesting. So we've got effectiveness versus execution, and the execution is what allows us to be effective. But then that comes down to the tactics.
Right.
And making sure we're doing the right things, that we're executing the right things. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. but it starts with the execution.
Okay. Anything else you can share regarding that?
I think that I think if you can get to 75 to 80%, you're doing well. A lot of people will say, I want to get to 100%. And they kind of stress themselves out because they're not, one day they're sick. And so they don't get to write 1,000 words for their book, or they've got to take their kid to the doctor. So they don't make those 20 phone calls for sales and prospecting. And I just remind people, I said, it's really hard to do anything 100%. And life is going to happen, and you've got to be flexible. And so if you give yourself that grace of executing at 80% or 75, you're going to get to where you're going. It might take you a little bit longer, but the journey will be a lot easier, and you'll be more in control of the steps that you have to take and whether you get there or not. So versus waiting for those one-off events.
Okay. Very good. So, Kevin, this is a podcast about money. And I have 3 questions I ask every one of my guests. And the first question is what is the smartest thing you've ever done regarding money as a solopreneur? And share that story if you would.
The smartest thing I have ever done was to hire someone, a VA, to help me with my execution because I was doing all the things, trying to wear all the hats, but I was dropping the ball when it comes to social media. And so I hired somebody to be in charge of that for me. And at first, it was a little scary because I wanted that control. It was my baby, it was my art. I was the one creating it, putting it out there, but I was doing the exact opposite of what I teach people about execution. I was just going out there and posting a couple days a week or a couple times a week, whereas I needed to be doing it daily or engaging with people more. And so, I heard somebody, her name's Kara. And so to watch her, just to be able to turn that over and to kind of let go, that was one of the things, after my surgery that I was like, this is what I need to do. And people always tell you they wait too late to hire, especially to get assistance. And I thought, oh, well, that's not me. So I had a little bit of hubris there that I was like, oh, that's not me. I can do it all. And obviously that was not the case. But hiring somebody was probably the smartest thing that I could do, especially when it comes to social media and helping me grow the business.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is huge gains that solopreneurs can make when you start to delegate and not thinking about anything of the value of your time. But if you just keep it simple and think, if I had 5 more hours to do the things I really needed to do, to execute the things that will move the needle,
Right.
it's amazing. Now let's bring in the value of your time. So let's say you pay a VA even $50 an hour, but you can generate 200, 300, 400, 500 an hour from that hour.
Right.
It makes the math starts to just make your decision for you. So that's a very smart move. Nice.
And you get to spend more time in your sweet spot, which, we want to enjoy our businesses. So the more we can do that, the better.
Oh, definitely. And when you're in your sweet spot, you're more effective because you're executing the things that you should be doing.
Absolutely.
So let's go to the other side. The biggest money mistake you've made regarding money. And what was that story?
Oh man, the biggest money mistake for me would be debt related. There was a time when I wanted things and I wanted them then, and I had that instant gratification. And a lot of it was related to the business. So a lot of it was putting things on credit cards to finance the start of the business instead of really focusing my time on going out and finding the clients that would generate the revenue to build the business. And so going into debt on a personal credit card to start the business, and then the stress that sits on your shoulders with that is, um, you know, for some people, you talk. I mean, I thought I was having a heart attack, but you know, it stress that related that made me that happen to me. I have no idea, but there's still things that I'm still paying off because I went so deep into the hole uh, on a credit card that I wish I would never done. And so I always tell people at this point, like, find another way. Just spend your time getting those first clients and let that generate what you need instead of going into debt. Now, you can do it smart and you can do it intelligently, but that's not the way that I went about it, unfortunately. So that's the one big thing I would change.
Yeah, there's a lot of us that have started our businesses on credit cards or borrowing from our retirement account or whatever it might be, because we didn't have everything put together properly when we made that change, or we just weren't smart with our money. That's why I started this podcast, was to help people make those decisions better as they go about making those changes or grow their business or whatever it might be. So that brings me to the final question, Kevin, and that is, what does mastering your finances mean to you?
Mastering my finances means that I can live my purpose and not have to worry about the money. It means so whatever my purpose is, and I'm still looking for parts of it, I'm living that out in a certain way through my business at this point, but it means generating the revenue so I can continue to spread the message. That's the biggest thing right now that mastering my finances means, because you can't spread a message without some resources being invested. But outside of the business, it means, again, still being able to do the things that I want to do, like spend time with my family or give or take time away from work so that I can volunteer and do those things. Or that maybe if there's a client that I want to work with, but I know that they can't afford it, I can do that with a smaller investment on their part, because the rest of my finances are in a place that allow me to do that.
That's fantastic. I appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to share regarding your story, for this whole life change that has been put upon you? Any other lessons you might have learned throughout that process?
I think the biggest lesson is for people who are intentional about living their lives, there is always another level. There's another level of contribution. There's another level of clarity. There's another level of stripping away what doesn't need to be there to get closer to what you do want to be present in your life. There's new levels of intimacy that you can have with your family and friends and being able to communicate. And all of that comes from intention. And it's easy to think that when we have intention in our lives, that there are points where we we've got it all figured out. Uh, but really, we're just getting to the next level. And that requires another level of intention, because the more options we create in our lives, the more clarity we need to know which options to ignore and which ones to dive into.
That's fantastic.
Thanks.
So, if any of my listeners would like to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Best way to find me is kevingainey.com or thebeingnesscoach.com. I think both of those will be in the show notes. On uh, Instagram, it's beingness coach or KW Gainey. So you can either follow me personally or professionally, and we'll see. You learn, you get a slightly different twist on both of those, but I think you get the whole picture that way.
Very good. And I think you've got an offer for someone to be able to download an offer from you at your website. What is that?
So I have a subscription service where once a month I go live and I talk about execution and mindset and high performance. So as a high performance coach and as a NLP practitioner, I help people focus on their mindset. And sometimes it's all up here, and sometimes it's what's the best tools and tactics to use. But it's basically, you get, access to me for a set price each month. And I think the coupon code will be in the show notes, but it's normally $50 a month. But for listeners, it's $29 a month, and you can sign up. And if it's for you, great. You get access to the coaching and like-minded people. You learn from them, and we all learn together. but it's just month to month, and you can take the tools and apply it and become more effective and a better executor.
Fantastic. I think that's great. Well, Kevin, I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. Pleasure to be here. I appreciate it.
Well, solopreneurs, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Kevin Gainey, the Beingness Coach. You can find all of the information, the promo code, as well as the show notes and his contact information in the show notes as well. And let me just wrap up with my takeaways. One, intentionality. You can always be more intentional, and I'll find a way to level up with your intentionality. And the big takeaway from his life-changing event was get your house in order. He was telling me before we got going how thankfully his son, who had turned 18 recently, was able to sign off on things for him. So make sure you get your wills put together, your powers of attorney put together, check your beneficiaries, make sure your insurance is up to date, make sure everything in your house is in order just in case something happens. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with a friend and have a great day.